Chapter 2. Divine Omnipotence. Nothing which implies contradiction falls under the omnipotence of God. Thomas Aquinas. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy, and if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. The possibility of answering it depends on showing that the terms good and almighty, and perhaps also the term happy, are equivocal. For it must be admitted from the outset that if the popular meanings attached to these words are the best, or the only possible meanings, then the argument is unanswerable. In this chapter, I shall make some comments on the idea of omnipotence, and, in the following, some on the idea of goodness. Omnipotence means power to do all, or everything. Note, the original meaning in Latin may have been power over or in all. I give what I take to be current sense. And we are told in Scripture that with God all things are possible. It is common enough in argument with an unbeliever to be told that God, if he existed and were good, would do this or that, and then, if we point out that the proposed action is impossible, to be met with the retort, "But I thought God was supposed to be able to do anything." This raises the whole question of impossibility. In ordinary usage, the word impossible generally implies a suppressed clause beginning with the word unless. So something is impossible unless. Thus, it is impossible for me to see the street from where I sit writing at this moment. That is, it is impossible to see the street unless I go up to the I go up to the top floor where I shall be high enough to overlook the intervening building. If I had broken my leg, I should say, "But it is impossible to go up to the top floor," meaning, however, that it is impossible unless some friends turn up who will carry me. Now, let us advance to a different plane of impossibility. By saying it is at any rate impossible to see the street so long as I remain where I am and the intervening building remains where it is. Someone might add, unless the nature of space or of vision were different from what it is. I do not know what the best philosophers and scientists would say to this, but I should have to reply, I don't know whether space and vision could possibly have been of such a nature as you suggest. Now it is clear that the words could possibly here refer to some absolute kind of possibility or impossibility, which is different from the relative possibilities and impossibilities we have been considering. I cannot say whether seeing round corners is, in this new sense, possible or not, because I do not know whether it is self-contradictory or not. But I know very well that if it is self-contradictory, it is absolutely impossible. The absolutely impossible, impossibility within itself, instead of borrowing it from other impossibilities which in their turn depend upon others, it has no unless clause attached to it. It is impossible under all conditions, and in all worlds, and for all agents. So the stage is set for the conversation. When we say that God can do all things, obviously, what Lewis is driving at is that God can do all things that are intrinsically possible. He cannot do all things that are intrinsically impossible. We have a scenario. He's sitting at his desk. He can't see across the street through the window. Why? There's a building in his way, something preventing him from seeing. So what he really means is not that it's impossible to see across the street at all. It's just that in the current circumstances, it's impossible to see across the street. Unless he goes up some stairs to the top floor, then he can see over the building that's in his way. Or if he has a broken leg, maybe he can't get up, and some friends show up to carry him upstairs. So what he means by saying it's impossible for me to see across the street is it's impossible unless circumstances are different. Now, what he's setting this up to discuss is all things are possible with God with no unless clauses. Only those things that are intrinsically possible, those things that are not flat-out contradictions, are things that are possible with God. So, for instance, someone couldn't respond if you said it's impossible for me to see across the street from where I'm sitting, they couldn't respond unless the nature of seeing was different than it is. Right? So with the ability to see around corners, for example, we can't see around corners, and we can't imagine a world where we could.
Mm-hmm.
We'd have to say that in that would require a universe to be different than the one we inhabit, and one we can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what such a universe would even look like. So we're talking about that is what Lewis is labeling something like an absolute impossibility. It's not an impossibility that would become possible if the circumstances were different. It's an impossibility, full stop. Okay?
Okay. Really quick, define intrinsically.
Of itself. Something that it's inborn. It's part of it. When you say that something is intrinsic to something else, say like a description of something is intrinsic to it, it means it comes with it as a necessary property of the thing. So I'll give you an example. I'll say that 4 legs are intrinsic to the definition of dog. It comes with it.
Mm.
Right? It's part of the definition itself. Lewis goes on to say, all agents here includes God himself. His omnipotence means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is no limit to his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the 2 other words God can. So we can't make God into something. We can't make something sensical simply because we put the word God can in front of it. God can do, and then you can put whatever you want in there. That doesn't mean it's possible just because you attach those words. Meaningless phrases, meaningless words, in other words, nonsense, doesn't suddenly become sensible because you attach those words to them. When we speak of things like this, we still have to make sense. And we can't just jump over a gap, a massive, huge, yawning gap in an argument simply because we attach the prefix God can to something. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things but non-entities. So when we talk about something that's intrinsically impossible, something that's impossible for all worlds and all agents and all personalities, when we say that with God all things are possible, that phrase still is true. Because the intrinsic impossibilities aren't things at all. They're non-entities. They don't exist. So to say that God can't do them is really a redundancy. Of course God can't do them. They're not things. They don't exist. And they're not possible to exist either, even for him. It is no more possible, Lewis goes on, for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of 2 mutually exclusive alternatives. Not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense, even when we're talking about God. It should, however, be remembered that human reasoners often make mistakes, either by arguing from false data or by inadvertence in the argument itself. We may thus come to think things possible which are really impossible, and vice versa. Note, for example, every good conjuring trick does something which to the audience, with their data and their power of reasoning, seems self-contradictory. So there's a scenario where we make a mistake. We see a magician pull a rabbit from a hat, and we say, that's impossible. Well, it's impossible with your level of knowledge and understanding, with the level of data, with the amount of data that you have. If you knew more, if you knew that the trick was really, that the magic was really just a trick, then it would no longer be impossible. You would know the trick.
Yeah.
You'd know why the trick was possible. So he's saying we can be mistaken in these things, and we often are. We ought, he goes on, therefore, to use great caution in defining those intrinsic impossibilities which even omnipotence cannot perform. So in other words, we shouldn't be too cavalier about saying what God can't do. Nevertheless, he's saying there are things that God can't do. Now, maybe we shouldn't be super loose about how we list those things, but there are those things. Those things do exist, things that God can't do. What follows is to be regarded less as an assertion of what they are, this list that we're talking about, than a sample of what they might be like. The inexorable laws of nature, inexorable, things that can't be moved, things that can't be changed, which operate in defiance of human suffering or desert, which are not turned aside by prayer, seem at first sight to furnish a strong argument against the goodness and power of God. A child with brain cancer that remains a child with brain cancer and dies a child with brain cancer, or a child that dies because of brain cancer, is a great example of this. We can imagine someone suffering greatly, whose parents and friends and the child themselves pray for relief from this affliction, and yet they die anyways. He says this seems to furnish a great argument, a strong argument against the goodness and power of God. If God could stop this thing, if God was all-powerful, why wouldn't he? I am going to submit that not even omnipotence could create a society of free souls without at some time creating a relatively independent and inexorable nature, a nature that can't be bargained with, in other words. There is no reason to suppose that self-consciousness, the recognition of a creature by itself as a self, can exist except in contrast with an other, a something which is not the self. It is against an environment, preferably a social environment, an environment of other selves, that the awareness of my self stands out. This would raise a difficulty about the consciousness of God if we were mere theists. Being Christians, we learn from the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity that something analogous to society exists within the divine being from all eternity, that God is love, not merely in the sense of being the Platonic form of love, but because, within him, the concrete reciprocities of love exist before all worlds and are thence derived to the creatures. Now, this is a really important point that needs to be established at the beginning of this discussion. The recognition of myself as an individual, in large part, depends on the fact that other individuals exist. We loosely say this when we say man is a social creature, right? That we're social beings, that we need society, that we need, and by society I don't mean a large superstructure composing a nation or something like that. That's a type of society, but a society can exist just between two people.
Yeah.
So we need society. We need some sort of interaction, some sort of reciprocity between one being and another. And when I say we need it, it may in fact be true that we need it in order to see ourselves as individuals. And Lewis is making that claim that that is in fact the case. That we need the society of individuals in order to see ourselves as individuals, in order to recognize what being an individual means. If we didn't have other individuals to bounce this idea of individuality off of, how would we know what it means to be an individual? So it's not just that an individual sort of arises in our consciousness because of other individuals, but it also arises in our, doesn't just arise in our consciousness because of other things, like I am not this wall, and I am not this chair, and you are not that book. You are something other than that, and you recognize that you are. Mostly because you can hurt yourself by coming into contact with these things in the wrong way. You bump into the wall, and the wall doesn't move. The wall is recalcitrant. Reality is recalcitrant. Right? It's stubborn. It pushes back, or doesn't move at all. So, in pain, in conflict, you could even say, we see ourselves as a little bit of, we get a little sense of our individuality. I am this thing and not that thing. But in the company of society, an environment with other people in it, this is where we truly begin to understand ourselves as individuals, thinking beings. And he says this begins at the very beginning with God. He said this would be a problem for us if we were mere theists, because If we are not able to see ourselves as individuals without society, then how, pray tell, does God see himself as an individual without the society of some other? And that would be a problem for us, he says, if we were mere theists, but we're not. As Christians, we understand the concept of the Trinity. Even at the beginning, before there was anything, there were the three. And there was reciprocity among them. And from that personality, from that society of individuals, the society of human individuals is derived.
Mm.
Lewis goes on to say, again, the freedom of a creature must mean freedom to choose, and choice implies the existence of things to choose between. A creature with no environment would have no choices to make, so that freedom, like self-consciousness, if they are not indeed the same thing, again demands the presence to the self of something other than the self. In order to choose, there have to be choices. Right? We can't choose. We can call it choice, but those choices are not real choices unless they are actually different. Right? I don't know if you've ever heard, there's a legal theory called Hobson's choice. It derives from a story. And a Hobson's choice is, if I'm remembering the story correctly, there's a man who rents out horses to people as they're traveling along the road. His stable is there by the road, and people come in to rent horses, and of course, they rent the best horses. They want to rent the strongest, the fastest horses, and so naturally, his strongest and fastest horses are always getting worn out, and so he determines that you can choose the horse you want to rent, as long as it's the one nearest to the door. And he always puts the weakest one nearest the door. So this is what's called a Hobson's choice. You're said that you have a choice, but do you really? You really only have one. In order for a choice to be a choice, there has to be an actual difference in the things you can choose.
Yeah.
So, in order for there to be free will of any kind, an actual difference between the things you can choose has to be apparent, and it has to be real. You can choose this thing or you can choose that thing, and those things have to be legitimately different.
You mean like the choice between life and death? You mean like the choices between life and death? Should you choose God or choose to?
That's a little further down the road, but yes, of course, the difference has to be there. You have to be able to, and I think this is what Lewis would say, you have to be able to choose to not be with God. You have to be able to choose to not be on God's side, right? To not serve God. In other words, there has to be something in the choice. He goes on, the minimum condition of self-consciousness and freedom, then, would be that the creature should apprehend God, and, therefore, itself as distinct from God. So we have to be able to understand God in some sense, and know ourselves to be different from him. It is possible that such creatures exist, aware of God and themselves, but of no fellow creatures. If so, their freedom is simply that of making a single naked choice, of loving God more than the self, or the self more than God. But a life so reduced to essentials is not imaginable to us. As soon as we attempt to introduce the mutual knowledge of fellow creatures, we run up against the necessity of nature, the environment we live in. Maybe there are creatures who only have this piece of knowledge, either God or me, and they can make a choice between those two things. But we can't imagine such creatures, because it isn't just for us, either God or me. It's God, me, or a multiplicity of other things that we call nature. People often talk as if nothing were easier than for two naked minds to meet or become aware of each other. Naked minds meaning without a body. Right? Just two consciousnesses. It's a tough word to say. A lot of S's in there. Just two consciousnesses meeting in what? Not an environment? This is very difficult to imagine. But I see no possibility of their doing so except in a common medium, which forms their external world or environment. There has to be some sort of place that those consciousnesses meet. They have to meet in a medium. They have to be able to communicate across the medium in order to know that the other consciousness is there at the very least. Even our vague attempt to imagine such a meeting between disembodied spirits usually slips in surreptitiously the idea of at least a common space and common time to give the co in coexistence a meaning. And space and time are already an environment. But more than this is required. If your thoughts and passions were directly present to me, like my own, without any mark of externality or otherness, how should I distinguish them from mine? And what thoughts or passions could we begin to have without objects to think and feel about? Nay, could I even begin to have the conception of external and other unless I had experience of an external world? So imagine that. You and I are good friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that my thoughts were as present and close to you as your own. That it was almost as if you were thinking them. How would you be able to distinguish your own thoughts from mine?
I don't think I could.
I don't think
In
any
fact,
of us could.
quite the opposite. I'd probably be annoyed.
Or just consider
Oh.
them your own thoughts. Because you couldn't how would you be able to distinguish the
You're right.
difference between the two? They
No,
would
you're right.
meld or overlap each other in a seamless thinking, right?
Hmm.
This is the problem with saying that, because what he's trying to do here is reduce this idea that God could have created a universe without pain. He's trying to reduce it to the absurdity that it ultimately is. How could God create a universe where we as individual beings with free will could exist and yet not exist in a universe where pain was possible? How could we do that? Well, we need to imagine a universe where consciousnesses could exist like our own, self-awarenesses could exist like our own, but without the ability or the possibility of pain. Well, we would need a non-environment, wouldn't we? We'd need a place that even there we're sneaking in the idea of environment just by using the word place, but we would need something where just our consciousnesses existed without any possibility of them butting up against something that would cause them pain.
Hmm.
So that's what we're trying to imagine right now. We're trying to imagine a world or something, because again, we're sneaking in ideas of a medium when we use the word world, but just, I guess we can sort of try to leap over that because we really don't have any other words. We're trying to imagine a scenario where two minds could meet without a medium. Because once we admit a medium, once we allow for a medium, we allow for pain. We allow for the possibility that the medium will not bend to our will.
Hmm. Okay. I'm starting to see.
You may reply as a Christian that God and Satan do, in fact, affect my consciousness in this direct way, without signs of externality. Yes, and the result is that most people remain ignorant of the existence of both. That's very well done. He's saying, well, you're saying that two minds couldn't exist in the same place, or two minds couldn't communicate without some sort of medium in which to do it in, because if they did, then, in my scenario where you and I are good friends, but if my thoughts were as close to your mind as your thoughts are, you wouldn't know the difference between me and you. It'd just be you, right? Yeah. And he says, but you may respond as a Christian, well, Satan and God affect man's minds just like that, right? They speak into their thoughts and cause them to some sort of communication or influence to occur there. And Lewis says, yes, they do. And what's the result of that? That most people remain ignorant of the existence of God and Satan because they're so close to them.
Hmm.
We may therefore, Lewis goes on, suppose that if human souls affected one another directly and immaterially, it would be a rare triumph of faith and insight for any one of them to believe in the existence of the others. How would I know if your thoughts were as present to me as my thoughts are to myself? How would I even know that someone named Adrian existed? How would I know that how would I come to that conclusion that the thoughts that were occurring in my head were actually those of someone else? I couldn't.
You couldn't without a medium.
It would take a remarkable leap of blind faith for me to believe that any other being other than myself actually existed. It would be harder for me to know my neighbor, Lewis says, under such conditions than it now is for me to know God. For in recognizing the impact of God upon me, I am now helped by things that reach me through the external world, such as the tradition of the church, Holy Scripture, and the conversation of religious friends. These things, he says, helps me come to a knowledge of God, where if all I had was the thoughts of myself, it would be difficult to get there. It would certainly be harder for me in that scenario to know my neighbor, whose existence would be a mere theory, because I would have no evidence of that existence, than it is for me to know God. Because I am able to know God not just through the influence that God has on my mind, pray that he does, but also, and far more likely, through the external world, the traditions of the church, which teach me something about God, the Holy Scriptures, which are recordings of what God's interactions with man, and the conversation of religious interactions, kind of like the one we're having now, and the one we're having with Lewis, God rest his soul. What we need for human society is exactly what we have: a neutral something, neither you nor I, an environment, which we can both manipulate so as to make signs to each other, which we can both manipulate so as to make signs for each other, to each other. Sorry, I put emphasis on the wrong word there in that sentence. I can talk to you because we can both set up sound waves in the common air between us. Matter, which keeps souls apart, also brings them together. So we are separated by an environment. Things come between us. And yet, it also provides us a medium through which to communicate. You couldn't hear me, like you wouldn't be able to hear me in space, if there weren't an atmosphere between us that could carry the vibrations of my vocal cords to your ears, and vice versa. So there is something between us. It does separate us, and it can cause us pain, but it also allows for communication. It also allows for us to be friends. It allows us the intimacies that only friendship affords. Matter, he says, which keeps souls apart, also brings them together. It enables each of us to have an outside as well as an inside, so that what are acts of will and thought for you are noises and glances for me. You are enabled not only to be, but to appear, and hence I have the pleasure of making your acquaintance. Can't help but smile at something like that.
Yeah.
Society then implies a common field or world in which its members meet. If there is an angelic society, as Christians have usually believed, then the angels also must have such a world or field, something which is to them as matter, in the modern, not the scholastic sense, is to us. But if matter is to serve as a neutral field, it must have a fixed nature of its own. If a world or material system had only a single inhabitant, it might conform at every moment to his wishes. Trees, for his sake, would crowd into a shade. But if you were introduced into a world which thus varied at my every whim, you would be quite unable to act in it, and would thus lose the exercise of your free will. So what we've got is the dispelling of the possibilities here, right? So one of the possibilities was, well, why didn't God create a world where there was no pain? What is one of the ways he could do that? Obviously, we're exercising this hypothetical with the small minds we have, but let's just try. One of the ways he could do that is to create a situation, a scenario where two minds could meet, and that's all that would meet. But we've already sort of dispelled that as not really something feasible, because there, how would we communicate? Would you just read my mind? And if so, how would you know my mind to be different from your own? We've kind of dispelled that as a possibility, right? Another possibility is maybe God could create this other world, this world that we're trying to imagine here, as a place where, yes, it does have other things in it, like an environment that we're sitting in right now, but it conforms to my every whim so that I'm never in pain as a consequence of it, right? So maybe I'm sitting out in the sun, and the sun is nicely warming my shoulders,
Yeah,
but then it
beaming
suddenly
down.
becomes too hot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I order, or I think, shade into existence, and trees, crowd into the space where I am to provide me that shade. Now, that's a world that is full of a lot of magic, but it's at least a world we can try to hypothetically imagine. But it is noticeably a world that only one person can live in. The moment another will, like yours, is introduced into that world, suddenly my whims are going to invariably come into conflict with yours.
Yeah.
So we're handling this as a problem too. We're trying to dispel this as a possibility also. What we're getting down to, what Lewis is driving at, is that the world we live in, populated by great wonders but also terrible pains, is the world that must be. Nor is it clear, he goes on, that you could make your presence known to me, all the matter by which you attempted to make signs to me being already in my control, and therefore not capable of being manipulated by you. This would probably be a lonely world. We see this with really powerful people a lot of times. Kings, emperors, tyrants, they don't really have friends. Why? Because everyone's too afraid to be real around them, or too cowardly to lose their favor. They want to remain in the king's favor. They want to remain in the tyrant's favor, or maybe just remain in the rich person's favor. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone with governmental authority. It can just be someone with a lot of money. And therefore, it's very hard to make friends. You become very lonely. How do you know when people are being real with you? How many rap stars have written songs about this very thing? It's very difficult, unless people see themselves as on an equal plane with you, whatever that means, to be your friend, to have any sort of intimacy with you. Because having that sort of intimacy requires some level of vulnerability by both parties. In other words, it requires reciprocity.
Yeah.
And how can there be reciprocity when, like a king, such power is had over the other individual? The individual that's not the king never comes through. In other words, I never meet you, even though you are standing before me. I never really meet you. And you, consequently, also never really meet me. At least, not the better version of me, if I'm the king in that scenario. Again, Lewis says, if matter has a fixed nature and obeys constant laws, not all states of matter will be equally agreeable to the wishes of a given soul, nor all equally beneficial for that particular aggregate of matter which he calls his body. If fire comforts that body at a certain distance, it will destroy it when the distance is reduced. Hence, even in a perfect world, the necessity for those danger signals which the pain fibers in our nerves are apparently designed to transmit. Does this mean an inevitable element of evil, in the form of pain, in any possible world? I think not. For while it may be true that the least sin is an incalculable evil, the evil of pain depends on degree, and pains below a certain intensity are not feared or resented at all. No one minds the process, warm, beautifully hot, too hot, it stings, which warns him to withdraw his hand from exposure to the fire. And, if I may trust my own feeling, a slight aching in the legs as we climb into bed after a good day's walking is, in fact, pleasurable. So pain is a curious experience because certain degrees of it you could call pleasant. People who are physically active, who exercise regularly, often have this, or who just have physically demanding jobs, often have this sense of satisfaction and even comfort from the soreness and the aching that they feel in their body when they finally crawl into bed at night or when they finally rest at the end of the day. That's not an uncomfortable feeling, although it could be described as pain. Soreness in the muscles after having exercised to the limits of your abilities and I say this as someone who exercises, sometimes gives someone a sense that I did well.
a sense of accomplishment.
I accomplished my goal. I took myself to a limit. I grew, in other words. I was refined today more than I was yesterday. This is true of walking. After you've walked a long distance, you settle into a chair and know, well, I came a long way today. So pain is curious in that way. It's not a binary. Sin is a binary. The least sin, he says, is an incalculable evil because it separates us from God. But pain is not really like that. It's by degrees. Sitting next to a warm fire is pleasurable. Sitting a little too close is kind of warm. Sitting closer is too hot, and a little closer still makes you feel pain.
Yeah.
You recoil, you retrieve your hand from the fire at that point. Lewis says, yet again, if the fixed nature of matter prevents it from being always and in all dispositions equally agreeable even in a single soul, much less is it possible for the matter of the universe at any moment to be distributed so that it is equally convenient and pleasurable to each member of the society. If a man traveling in one direction is having a journey downhill, a man going in the opposite direction must be going uphill. So we can't have it both ways. Everybody can't be walking downhill at the same time. Because some of us are going to be going in the opposite direction. In other words, more wills admits more conflicts, or possible conflicts. They don't necessarily have to conflict, but it's possible for them to conflict. If even a pebble lies where I want it to lie, it cannot, except by coincidence, be where you want it to lie. And this is very far from being an evil. On the contrary, it furnishes occasion for all hope, for all those acts of courtesy, respect, and unselfishness by which love and good humor and modesty express themselves. If we could have it, we're back to the king example here. If you could have it your way all the time, and no one ever objected to anything, what kind of individual would this make you? It would make you someone who never has to engage in hospitality. Someone who never has to engage in anything like courtesy or respect or unselfishness when you're dealing with another individual who might not want things the way you want them. In other words, it prevents any possibility of humility or growth. Because when you have to deal with someone else's desires or needs, you have to subordinate, often, your own. And this isn't an evil. In fact, the best people among us do this the most. Not to the point where they become a doormat. We're not talking about that. But we are talking about someone who, who's able to recognize what's important and subordinate their will to it.
So you mean like, I don't know, possibly somebody having a better idea than you getting out of the way so that theirs could...
That's definitely an expression of it. We could say this we could see this happening in a creative endeavor or in a business endeavor. If everything is always going to be my way, I have no guarantee that I'm right. That's a big problem. And this is the problem that centrally planned sort of communistic style governments have. How do you know that you may be well-intentioned? You may have the best goals in mind, but you're probably wrong in almost everything. And so, if no one is ever allowed to present any other idea than your own, which is inevitably what happens in those types of societies, more suffering occurs, not less. Because everyone has to suffer from the wrong decisions that you make, from your limited knowledge, even if you have a beneficent will and beneficent intentions. So we're also talking, just lastly here, about character. It's not just that pain, pleasure or satisfying pain would be avoided. That pain we talked about that you felt when you sat down in a chair at the end of a long day, knowing you deserved the rest, knowing you accomplished something worthwhile. We're also talking about the hindrance that such a situation, if we removed all of those things, would have to the development of an individual's character. So it's not just the niceties of the feeling of a job well done that pain can sometimes bring, but also we're talking about the limitation of a person's ability to develop character, humility, good morals, refined sense of goodness and truth. But it certainly leaves the way open to a great evil, he says, that of competition and hostility. So here's the negative side of this. We have the possibility of cultivating unselfishness and humility, but we also have the possibility of encouraging competition and hostility in the negative sense. Competition in the negative sense. And if souls are free, they cannot be prevented from dealing with the problem by competition, instead by courtesy. And once they have advanced to actual hostility, they can then exploit the fixed nature of matter to hurt one another. The permanent nature of wood, which enables us to use it as a beam, also enables us to use it for hitting our neighbor on the head. The permanent nature of matter, in general, means that when human beings fight, the victory ordinarily goes to those who have superior weapons, skill, and numbers, even if their cause is unjust. We can perhaps conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will by his creatures at every moment, so that a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set up in it the sound waves that carry lies or insults. This is what governments attempt to do oftentimes, right? They say we want free speech, but what they really mean is we want speech so long as it agrees with what we want people to say. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which therefore freedom of the will would be void. It would be meaningless to say we had freedom of will in that sense, or in that situation. Nay, if the principle were carried out to its logical conclusion, evil thoughts would be impossible. For the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame those evil thoughts, to frame them, he says. All matter in the neighborhood of a wicked man would be liable to undergo unpredictable alterations. That God can and does on occasions modify the behavior of matter and produce what we call miracles is part of the Christian faith. But the very conception of a common, and therefore stable, world demands that these occasions should be extremely rare. Otherwise, what would a miracle mean? A miracle is a break with what we expect. It's a deviation from the normal, by definition. So miracles couldn't always be occurring. Otherwise, they wouldn't in fact be miracles. In a game of chess, you can make certain arbitrary concessions to your opponent. Someone can take back a move, for example, and you can let it happen, which stands to the ordinary rules of the game as miracles stand to the laws of nature. They're breaking the rules, kind of, right?
Yes.
You can deprive yourself of a castle, or allow the other man sometimes to take back a move made inadvertently. But if you conceded everything that at any moment happened to suit him, your opponent, if all his moves were revocable, and if all your pieces disappeared whenever their position on the board was not to his liking, then you could not have a game at all. So it is with the life of souls in a world. Fixed laws, consequences unfolding by casual necessity, the whole natural order, are at once the limits within which their common life is confined, and also the sole condition under which any such life is possible. Try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature and the existence of free wills involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. As I said before, this account of the intrinsic necessity of a world is meant merely as a specimen of what they might be. What they really are, only omniscience has the data and the wisdom to see. But they are not likely to be less complicated than I have suggested. Needless to say, complicated here refers solely to the human understanding of them. We are not to think of God arguing, as we do, from an end coexistence of free spirits to the conditions involved in it, but rather of a single, utterly self-consistent act of creation which to us appears, at first sight, as the creation of many independent things, and then as the creation of things mutually necessary. Even we can rise a little beyond the conception of mutual necessities as I have outlined it, can reduce matter as that which separates souls and matter as that which brings them together under the single concept of plurality, whereof separation and togetherness are only two aspects. With every advance in our thought, the unity of the creative act and the impossibility of tinkering with the creation as though this or that element of it could have been removed will become more apparent. Perhaps this is not the best of all possible universes, but the only possible one. Possible worlds can mean only worlds that God could have made, but didn't. The idea of that which God could have done involves a too anthropomorphic conception of God's freedom. Whatever human freedom means, divine freedom cannot mean indeterminacy between alternatives and choice of one of them. Perfect goodness can never debate about the end to be attained, and perfect wisdom cannot debate about the means most suited to achieve it. The freedom of God consists in the fact that no cause other than himself produces his acts, and no external obstacles impedes them. That his goodness is the root from which they all grow, and his own omnipotence the air in which they all flower. And so we have a world that Lewis is describing where perfect omniscience, all knowledge, creates individual beings. The things that make those individual beings possible are a consequence of that. So, in order for God to create a universe where I can be me and you can be you, and we can know the difference between those two things, and I can have the pleasure of making your acquaintance, things like an atmosphere are necessary. Something for us to communicate with, a medium for us to communicate by. And it also requires the hard stuff that comes between us to exist also. The chair you're sitting on is comfortable enough. Stub your shin against it, and you might have a different opinion of the chair. And so these consequences of having created individuals, of having created beings who can know themselves as individuals, are the external world we inhabit. Without them, we couldn't be. Or at least we couldn't be as an I, as a thou. And that brings us to our next subject, the divine goodness. Nothing so far has been said of this, and no answer attempted. The objection that if the universe must, from the outset, admit the possibility of suffering, then absolute goodness would have left better than not to create. So, if that's the case, if it's better that, or if God needed to introduce the possibility of suffering in order for individuals to be, in order for them to be here, well, then it would be better that he didn't create at all. In this case, we're still indicting God as an evil being, possibly, or at least as a stupid one. Was God evil? Knowing this, knowing that pain was possible, knowing that suffering was a possibility of individuals existing in an environment with a recalcitrant reality surrounding them, was God evil to create them, or was he incompetent? I am aware of no human scales, Lewis goes, in which such a portentous question can be weighed. Like, I don't even know how to think about that, he's saying. Some comparison between one state of being and another can be made, but the attempt to compare being and not being ends in mere words. So, it's better for God not to create. Better for whom? Is what Lewis is really saying.
Yeah.
I can say that I would rather be one person instead of another. A kid can say he would rather be an eagle or a dog, or an army man, right? But that's because he has something to compare it to. He sees the life of the dog, chasing its tail, eating, frolicking in the grass, sleeping all day, and says, that's the life I want. But how could you compare non-being to your current state? What do you have to compare it to?
You're saying, how could someone say it'd be better that none of this existed? And pregnant in that is that non-existence would be better,
Right.
than the life we're living now.
Any life. Right. Just existence, period.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, non-existence would be better than existence, whatever that existence entailed. But Lewis is saying that's not a comparison that any of us can make, because we don't know what non-existence is. He says comparisons like this end in mere words.
So this God-given medium, those who make those arguments that non-existence would be better, they're using God's tools to make these arguments.
Well, they're definitely doing that, but I don't think that's his main point. I think he just means that they're speaking nonsense.
Hmm.
In fact, he goes on to illustrate that in the last paragraph of this chapter. He quotes this hypothetical person as saying, "It would be better for me not to exist." In what sense for me? He asks. How should I, if I did not exist, profit by not existing? Our design is a less formidable one. It is only to discover how, perceiving a suffering world, and being assured on quite different grounds that God is good, we are to conceive that goodness and that suffering without contradiction.